Episode 1. The morning God didn't knock. They thought he was just having another nightmare, but nightmares don't leave marks. Not like that. Not like a perfectly scorched crucifix seared into the bare skin of an 8-year-old's chest. It was Sister Miriam who screamed first. The boy Daniel had woken in the orphanage infirmary, sitting upright, his breath sharp and feral like something wild had touched him in his sleep. His bed sheets were soaked. His fingernails had cracked from clenching, but it was the cross that made the entire room freeze. No blood, no infection, just flesh branded, wet, and angry, as if a divine branding iron had visited him during the night and chosen him without consent. He didn't cry. I heard a voice. He whispered to the nun. It said, "You are mine now." The doctor said it was psychosomatic. The priest said it was demonic, but the mark never faded. And the boy, he changed. I remember watching him from the hallway that morning. I wasn't supposed to be there. The other kids at St. Delphina slept through it, but something had pulled me from my bed. Call it curiosity, or fate, or something else entirely. He saw me through the crack in the door. His eyes locked onto mine. They weren't frightened. They were ancient. I didn't move. I couldn't. Then he spoke, again quietly, to no one or maybe to something I couldn't see. "It hurts when he looks at me," he said, and I knew it didn't mean Father Jonah or the headmaster. He meant God, or whatever was wearing God's name. By afternoon, word had spread. The church sent a visitor, a man dressed not like a priest but like a whisper of one. All in gray, no cross, no smile, eyes like wet stone. He didn't ask for Daniel's permission. He didn't bless him. He simply stood there for 5 minutes, staring, as if scanning for a code written in flesh. Then he nodded and said, "It's begun." That night, the chapel doors swung open by themselves. Candles lit without flame, and Daniel knelt under the altar, not praying but listening to something below. People say miracles bring peace, but what happened that day didn't bring peace. It brought silence, the kind that makes your ears ring because even the dead are holding their breath. And this was only the first morning. Episode 2. The man who collected signs. His name was Elias Graven. No one knew if that was his real name or just the one the church gave him when things went wrong. He didn't walk into the orphanage. He arrived like a shadow peeling off from the storm that hung over St. Delphina's roof that evening. No umbrella, no Bible, just a leather case, old as ash, and a silence that silenced other silences. Sister Miriam looked at him and stepped back like she had just touched an open grave. "This is no exorcism," he said before anyone spoke. "This is recognition." I watched from the stairwell as he entered Daniel's room. Daniel didn't flinch, didn't cry, didn't even blink. The cross on his chest stirred, glowing faintly in the candlelight seemed to pulse when Graven stepped closer. "You remember me?" the man asked, his voice dry as if it hadn't tasted hope in decades. Daniel nodded. Then he said, "You were at my dream's gate, but you didn't come in." That was the moment I knew something was deeply, terrifyingly wrong. This wasn't a demon infestation. This wasn't a possession. This was an invitation, and Daniel had answered it. Later that night, Graven unpacked the contents of his case on the chapel's floor. A relic dipped in martyr's blood, a rosary made of shattered bone, pages not from any Bible I'd ever seen. They were wrapped in red thread and covered in script that bled if you stared too long. "This child," he said to the head priest, "is not cursed." "Then what is he?" someone asked. Graven's answer chilled the pews. "He's marked, not by hell, not by heaven, but by whatever lies between them and hates both." At midnight, Daniel screamed again, not from pain, from hunger. He wasn't craving food. He was craving something else, something that made the walls of the orphanage sweat with crosses and whispers, something that made every crucifix in the building tilt. As if ashamed, I pressed my ear to the wooden door of his room, and what I heard still won't leave me. "I didn't ask for this," Daniel whispered, "but it keeps waking me up before I'm done dreaming." The cross on his chest was no longer just a wound. It was an eye, and it had begun to open. Episode 3. The eye beneath the cross. They tried covering it with holy oil, with ash, with stitched linen soaked in prayers whispered by trembling nuns. But the cross on Daniel's chest didn't fade. It pulsed like a second heart, and by the third night, it began to see, not just look, see. It started with the birds. They gathered on the orphanage roof, silent as tombstones, eyes black, beaks shut, not crows, not doves, things in between, things that didn't belong in this world or the next. When Elias Craven stepped out into the yard that evening, he stared at them and murmured a word I'd never heard, a word that made every light in the orphanage flicker, and the birds vanish in unison, as if sucked into a breath God never meant to take. That night, Daniel began speaking in languages no one taught him. One moment, he was praying in Latin. The next, he whispered in tongues that cracked the mirror above his bed. And when Sister Miriam rushed to his side, he looked at her and said, with a voice that wasn't his, "He is not watching you anymore. You're safe to send." She dropped her rosary. The church sent new men the next morning, not priests, inspectors. They didn't carry crosses. They carried cameras, scalpels, scanners. Craven stopped them at the gate. "If you record the divine," he told them, "it starts recording you back." But they left scientists in black suits with silver gloves. They walked into Daniel's room, machines humming. They walked out 5 minutes later. One was sobbing. Another bit his own tongue off and collapsed. The last one just said, "I blinked. I crept in after they left." Daniel was awake, his eyes soft but exhausted, like someone who had seen too much heaven and far too much hell. He turned to me and said, "It's not a cross anymore. It's a door, and something behind it is knocking." He looked down at his own chest, then whispered, "The fourth night. That's when it steps through." I asked him what it was. He smiled. Not a demon, not an angel, just what God tried to forget. And then the chapel bells rang on their own, even though they'd been broken for years. And the sound, it wasn't metal, it was breathing. Episode 4 of The Fourth Night. You could feel it before it came, not like a storm. Worse, the walls of St. Delphinus breathed in sync with the darkness. The statues of saints, once gentle and blind, now seemed to watch, not in comfort, in warning. Elias Craven Saturday in the chapel with the lights off. He hadn't moved in hours, only prayed with his eyes open, lips sealed, like a man waiting for his own execution. The fourth night, he had whispered, isn't about arrival, it's about recognition. At exactly 3:03 a.m., the cross on Daniel's chest began to bleed. No cuts, no wound, just bleeding, as if the flesh remembered something it wasn't supposed to. He didn't cry, he didn't scream, he laughed, softly. Then he said, "He finally sees me back." I stayed in the hallway, clutching the rosary I hadn't prayed with in years. It felt like holding a phone with no signal while hell was calling. In the room, Daniel Saturday upright in bed, his skin had gone pale, his eyes black, not from shadow, but from memory, from seeing too much through the eye on his chest. He pointed to the ceiling, and every candle in the orphanage lit, all at once, without flame, without heat, just light, and not the holy kind. A wooden cross above his bed split in two. No one touched it. Then came the sound. It didn't come from the walls. It came from below the floorboards, like something dragging its hands through centuries of dust and bones, clawing upward, trying to reach the child, or the eye, or maybe both. Elias Craven rushed in, his breath ragged. He held a vial of what he called salt of second death. It had only ever been used once before, he said, in a monastery that no longer exists on any map. He poured a drop onto Daniel's chest. The cross hissed, smoke rose, and Daniel began to speak back in the language of whatever was beneath him. Then everything went still, utter silence, until Daniel said, "He's not here to possess me. He's here to confess." I don't know what's worse, a child hearing the devil, or a child forgiving him. And so the fourth night ended, with no exorcism, no salvation, only a conversation between a boy and something the Bible never had the courage to name. Episode 5, The First Confession. It didn't sound like thunder, it sounded like regret. That was the first thing I felt when the voice spoke in a rage. Not chaos, but a sadness so ancient, it made the crucifix in the hallway weep. Literally, the eyes of the porcelain Christ bled, slow, deliberate, and somewhere below the chapel, something began to speak through Daniel. His voice shifted, deeper, not monstrous, not growling, just wrong, like a child trying to remember how to scream in a language the womb forgot. I never meant to leave him, Daniel said, but it wasn't Daniel anymore. Elias Graven dropped to one knee. His hands trembled as he opened the cursed pages wrapped in red thread. They always begin with sorrow, he muttered. Even the damned remember love. I inched closer to the doorway of Daniel's room. The air smelled of burnt scripture and roses left along on a grave. Daniel's eyes were open, but not looking at anything we could see. His chest glowed across, now pulsing with golden veins, as though it were alive. Then he spoke again. Before the fall, I sent for him. My name wasn't erased, it was buried. And suddenly, every mirror in the orphanage cracked at once. Not shatter-cracked, like they were strained to reflect something they weren't allowed to remember. Graven asked the question none of us dared. Who are you? Daniel turned his head slowly, but his eyes, they didn't move. I was the lullaby of heaven's youngest stars, the whisper in the first silence, the one who loved him too much to obey. It wasn't a demon, not in the way we understood. It was a fallen memory, a fragment of something too holy to be damned, but to disobey and to be forgiven. And Daniel somehow was his vessel, or maybe it's harder. That's when Daniel began to cry, not like a child, like a confessor, like someone who just heard the truth from a voice that bled eternity. It doesn't want redemption, Daniel whispered. He wants to be remembered. The candles blew out on their own, not with wind, but with shame. And then Daniel fell back onto the bed, unconscious. The eye on his chest closed, but not before it looked at all of us, and blinked. That night, no one slept, because now we knew the cross wasn't a curse. It was an invitation, and we had just opened the first page of a forgotten gospel loan written by something that heaven had tried to silence. Episode 6, The Gift Left Inside Him. They thought the worst had passed, but no one ever questions why a confession is given, because a confession is always a prelude to judgment or to inheritance. And what Daniel had received wasn't forgiveness, it was a gift. The morning after the fourth night, he didn't wake up like a child. He rose like something had been installed into him. He didn't blink, didn't stretch. He just sat there, staring at the wall, lips moving silently as if continuing a conversation none of us could hear, until he looked up, and in a voice calm as prophecy, he said, "He left something inside me, not a demon, not a spirit, a task." The room around him had changed, not visibly, not to the eye, but the atmosphere was thicker, like stepping into a place where time held its breath. Paint peeled where his fingers touched, crosses hung slightly crooked just enough to make you feel watched. Elias Graven approached with caution. "What did he give you, child?" Daniel smiled, but only on one side of his face. "A name, not mine. His, the true one." Graven paled. He stepped back and opened his book. The cursed one? He flipped through pages until he reached a blank one. But now, it wasn't blank. A word had appeared, written in blood and in ash. A word no tongue was meant to pronounce. A name that had been ripped from heaven's records. Daniel spoke it once, just once. The walls screamed, not creaked, not cracked, screamed as if they had memory, and that name brought it back. Later that night, Sister Miriam tried to enter his room again. She didn't make it past the doorway. The crucifix around her neck ignited real flame, and she collapsed to her knees, whispering apologies to a God that suddenly felt very far away. I snuck in after. I know I shouldn't have. Daniel was writing in the dark, with his finger on the wall. Words that glowed faintly. When I asked him what they meant, he said, "They're not warnings, they're instructions." I asked for what. He looked at me, not cruelly, but with sorrow, for what to do when God finally goes silent and something else answers the prayers. And then he whispered, "It's not possession, it's preparation." Episode 7, The Warning, written in blood. By the time the morning bell rang at St. Delphinus, no one heard it, because the walls were whispering louder than the bell ever could. They didn't echo voices, they breathed them. And the name Daniel spoke the night before was still vibrating in the stone. But the children didn't notice. Not yet. Only those who had prayed recently felt it. A twisting of the soul, like their amen had reached the wrong ears. When I returned to Daniel's room, I wasn't alone. Elias Graven stood frowning in the doorway. And Daniel, he wasn't writing anymore. He was finishing something. The wall above his bed was soaked in symbols, drawn in his own blood, lines that curved like ancient maps, letters that curled like smoke caught in a scream. But one phrase stood out, written imperfect, tremble in English. When the sky stops blinking, leave the altar. He will be looking for who northeast tells last. Graven stepped forward and pressed his gloved fingers to the words. The blood didn't smear. It pulsed, alive, like a command carved into living scripture. He whispered, "This is the first warning." I asked what that meant. Graven turned to me with eyes that looked far older than his body. Before judgment comes, the marked always leave signs. Not for the faithful, but for the survivors. That afternoon, the sun flickered. Not clouds, not a storm, just flickered, like the sky itself had blinked and nearly forgotten to open its eyes again. And when it did, half the crucifixes in the orphanage had melted. The other half turned upside down. And Daniel, he simply said, "We have 3 days." Later, the choir room was found destroyed, not vandalized, not burned, hollowed, like sound itself had been ripped out of it. The hymn books were untouched except one. It had a single phrase carved across its cover, deep and jagged. The choir one T sang for him this time. That night, I watched Daniel sleep. He murmured something in his dreams, and as I leaned closer, I finally heard it. He's not angry, he's lonely, and somehow, that terrified me more than any demon ever could, because loneliness is how the holy forget their purpose, and how monsters remember theirs. Episode 8, the first song, From the Other Side of the Cross. It began at exactly 3:16 a.m., not with a scream, not with thunder, but with a psalm, a lullaby sung in reverse, a melody stitched together with syllables that didn't belong in the mouths of mortals. The notes didn't rise, they descended, like something was being buried note by note beneath the skin of the night, and it came from Daniel's room. Elias Graven burst in first. I followed because fear had stopped being a reason to stay away. Daniel was floating, not high, just enough to make you question if your eyes were lying. His chest glowed, the cross burned softly like a lantern behind ribs too small to hold a secret this heavy. And his mouth was open, but the voice wasn't his. It was layered, like a choir trapped in a well, and each voice inside him was mourning. Sister Miriam tried to pray, but her voice cracked. Not from fear but because her tongue refused. She fell to her knees, crying, not from terror, from recognition. I heard this song before, she whispered, when I was a child, the night my mother died. It played in my dream. Graven turned pale, then opened his book. The page flipped itself, and there it was, when the first song is heard again. The gate is awake. Daniel's eyes snapped open mid-harmony, but it didn't scream. He sighed, as if waking from a long dream that wasn't his to dream. It's louder now, he whispered. He's closer. He's remembering the shape of his own voice. Graven grabbed the relic of silence from his case. A small, obsidian disc said to have once been used to mute the cries of angels who begged to stay fallen. He pressed it to Daniel's forehead. The song stopped, but in the silence, we heard the real horror, not from Daniel, from the walls. They were humming, softly, as if learning the melody. At dawn, 3 children were missing. No blood, no struggle, just their rosaries melted into their pillows. And on the chapel wall, written in gray ash, the song is a door, and some of us learn north, east, dit to well. I asked Graven why it was happening. Why Daniel? He didn't answer, not directly. He just said, God writes with light, but sometimes he erases with song. And now the tune was spreading, room to room, soul to soul, note by note. Episode 9, the boy who sang backwards to God. That night, Daniel stopped dreaming because he had become the dream itself, not the innocent kind, the kind that reminds heaven what it tried to forget. He Saturday at the end of his bed, humming the same melody from before, but now he was adding to it, layer by layer, note by note. His lips moved in reverse. His hums echoed like footsteps walking backward through creation. Elias Graven didn't stop him this time. He only watched. I've seen this before, he said, in a monastery buried beneath the Dead Sea. A boy, marked with a crescent wound. He began to hum like this, before the angels refused to enter his village ever again. The walls of St. Delphinus began to absorb the sound. Plaster cracked, but not outward, inward. as if the building itself was trying to hide something it had just remembered. At 3:33 a.m., Daniel whispered a single line. He taught me this song when I was in the womb. And then, like a choir exhaling, the mirrors began to show things they shouldn't. I passed one in the hallway and saw myself praying, but in a chapel I had never stepped into. Another mirror showed Sister Miriam holding a newborn wrapped in ash. Another showed the sky, but the stars, they were falling like broken glass. Daniel turned his face toward us. Slowly, the eye-shaped cross on his chest had opened again, wide now pulsing with something older than light. It wasn't God who marked me, he said. It was the one who mourned him first. And then, in a voice that did not belong to this earth, I was born from a prayer that should never have been heard. Elias knelt not out of reverence, but fear, not of Daniel, but of who was listening through him. Suddenly, every candle in the orphanage was snuffed out. No wind, no movement, just obedience, as if something had entered, something that didn't need doors. And in that pitch black, Daniel began to sing again, but this time, the building sang with him. Wood creaked in harmony, pipes howled in counterpoint, the floorboards wept. And in that moment, I understood. He wasn't singing backwards to God. He was calling someone who once stood beside him and was never forgiven. Episode 10, the one who answered without knocking. They say when heaven speaks, the earth trembles. But that night, it was the air that fled first. Breath refused to stay in our lungs. Silence wasn't empty anymore. It was crowded because he had arrived, and he didn't need a door, or a name, or permission. Daniel stopped singing, not because he forgot the words, but because the room no longer needed sound. It vibrated with presence, like standing in a cathedral that was still being created, but built with grief instead of stone. Elias' graven hands clenched the spine of his black scripture, but it crumbled in his grip. The ink bled from the pages, as if ashamed to still be read in this presence. It's him, Graven whispered. I asked, who? He didn't answer me. He answered the darkness, the one who wept first, when God looked away. Daniel rose from the floor, his feet not touching it, his eyes rolled white, his chest glowing gold and crimson like a sun in labor. And from deep within his rib cage, a voice answered that none of us expected. I never left. I was just listening for the day someone would dare to sing me back. And, ton, the crucifix on the chapel wall shattered, not from impact, from rejection, like it knew it had failed to protect this place. The windows turned black, not dark black, like light refused to enter a space where something older than obedience had arrived. And still, no footsteps, because he didn't walk. He was the space. He was the room. Daniel's arms stretched outward, and his mouth opened, wide to wide, as if a choir had taken root in his throat and was now trying to crawl out. But no sound came. Only heat, only pressure, only understanding. Then he spoke again, from everywhere. I was not cast down. I knelt, and heaven mistook it for rebellion. Sister Miriam collapsed. Her rosary melted into her palm, but she didn't scream. She whispered, he's not the devil. He's what the devil used to pray to. And in the center of Daniel's chest, the cross blinked and then it cracked from the inside. Episode 11, the birth behind the cross. The crack in Daniel's chest wasn't made of flesh. It was made of memory, the kind God erased, and hell refused to inherit. And in hell, it had found a way back into the world. He stood motionless, his arms out like a crucifix too heavy for a boy's frame. The skin around the cross peeled softly, not like an injury, but like a veil being drawn aside. Something inside was glowing, pulsing, moving, not with violence, with intention. Elias Graven began to weep. He dropped to his knees and whispered words from no language I knew. Not Latin, not Hebrew, not human. It was devotion without loyalty. Sister Miriam clutched her melted rosary, but it didn't save her from what she saw, because none of us were meant to witness a birth inside a symbol of death. But there it was, crawling out of the burning shape carved into Daniel's chest. A shape that wasn't a creature, or a demon, or even light. It was a face, no eyes, no mouth, just a face made of everything that had ever been forgotten in prayer. And it opened, not to scream, to look at us. Daniel's voice was gone, but something else spoke now through every mouth in the orphanage. At once, even the silent children, even the dead ones in the ground. All of them spoke as one. You called us evil, you named us lost, but we were only waiting for one child brave enough to carry the guilt of a silent heaven. Books flew open, the stained glass shattered, but the shards floated in the air, refusing to fall. Like the laws of gravity, were suspended for this one moment of divine contradiction. The face in Daniel's chest blinked once, and when it did, everyone in the chapel remembered a sin they never committed, but felt guilty for. And that was the point. This wasn't punishment. This was remembrance of what was done in God's name, of what was buried under altars. Then Daniel finally spoke again, but it wasn't Daniel. It was what had finished being born. I am not here to destroy faith. I am here to return what was erased and see if you still believe after that. And the face faded, not into light, but into every single one of us. Episode 12. When faith stood still, the face was gone, but it had left something behind. Not a scar, not a mark, a presence, like guilt that breathes, like truth that refuses to be buried. And Daniel, the boy who once trembled in his sleep, now sat silently beneath the chapel's broken cross, with no fear in his eyes, just stillness, as if he was waiting for us to choose. The orphans stopped playing, not from command, from understanding. They began to walk toward Daniel. One by one, some cried, some smiled, some just stood in silence, like their souls had been invited to remember something holy to survive inside a church. Elias Graven stood at the altar, whispering a prayer that no longer worked. Faith is not about knowing, he muttered, it's about choosing. But what if both options had already been corrupted? What if the light wasn't clean and the darkness wasn't cruel? What if everything we believed was only the echo of something far older, far lonelier? Sister Miriam tried to lift her Bible. It turned to ash in her hands, not from fire, from irrelevance. Daniel rose. His voice returned low, calm, full of echoes. Heaven hasn't spoken in centuries. Hell doesn't want to. And now something in between is asking if we still believe, even when there's no one left to answer. And no one did. Because how do you answer a question when it's written on your soul and you didn't put it there, outside? The sun stopped, not set, not disappeared. It just paused, as if the sky itself was holding its breath to hear what we would do next. That's when Daniel walked to the center of the chapel. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't command. He simply invited. If your faith was never tested, how do you know it was yours? And done. He stepped back, knelt, and waited, not for God, not for the devil, but for us. And in that stillness, every person at St. Delphina's made a choice to kneel, to stand, or to walk away. And whatever we chose, we knew the eye on Daniel's chest had seen it, recorded it, and would remember us accordingly. Episode 13. The Weighing of the Silent. There was no thunder, no trumpet, no voice from the sky, just the sound of wood, creaking, groaning, the chapel itself bending, as if something vast and unseen had just Saturday in judgment. Daniel didn't speak. He didn't have to. The cross on his chest snow-cracked, glowing, and silently pulsing had become more than a symbol. It was a scale, and we were all already on it. Elias Graven stood first, not with pride, not with fear, with acceptance. I knew it would come to this, he said, placing his relics on the altar like broken offerings. He looked at Daniel. No, through Daniel. If silence was faith, I have been the most devout. The eye on the cross blinked, once, twice, then turned black. Graven gasped. His knees buckled, and his body didn't fall. It unwound, not in pain, but like a thread being pulled back into the soul it was stitched from. And then nothing. He was gone. No scream, no ash, just absence. Sister Miriam sobbed, but Daniel shook his head. Don't mourn him. He was never lost. He was only finished. Then it was my turn. The room seemed to fade as I stepped forward. No one pushed me, but truth has gravity, and I was already falling into it. I thought about all the nights I watched Daniel from the shadows, all the moments I prayed with my mouth, but never my heart, and all the times I said amen, just to fill the space between questions I was too afraid to ask. The eye watched me. It didn't judge. It waited. And I whispered, I never believed enough to kneel, but never stopped wishing someone was listening. Daniel smiled, soft, said, then maybe you were the only honest one. The eye closed, and I was still standing, not pure, not damned, just accounted for. One by one, each child came forward. Some were embraced, some vanished in light, some were left unto shed alive, but emptied, until only Daniel remained, and one name was spoken, not by him, but by the air itself. Miriam. She turned, and the eye opened wide, and in its reflection, we saw her not as she was, but as she had been when she first arrived. A girl, on fire with belief, before the church taught her to fear her own doubt. And she said nothing, because silence was all she had left. The room trembled, not with wrath, with sorrow. And then, for the first time in the story, Daniel wept. Episode 14, the farewell that wasn't meant for us. Daniel didn't die. He didn't disappear. He withdrew, like a soul folding itself back into the idea that created it. And as it stood beneath the shattered chapel dome, you could feel it. The world was preparing to let him go, but not because it wanted to, because it had to. The cross on his chest no longer burned. It no longer blinked. It glowed soft, gold, and impossibly sad, like a star remembering its own death. He turned to us, not with power, but with something holier, understanding. You never failed me, he said. You just worshipped with closed eyes. No one responded, because we felt what came next. The way you feel sunrise on your skin before it even breaks the horizon. One by one, the children knelt, not because they were told to, but because their hearts, for the first time in their lives, were not afraid of silence. Daniel stepped onto the altar barefoot, weightless. Time seemed to pause. Even the wind outside stopped rustling the trees. Then he looked at his friend, his witness, his unwanted historian, and he said, "Don't follow, don't search, just remember, that's how I remain real." Behind him, a light opened, but it wasn't heaven, it wasn't hell, it was memory made into space, like a cathedral of forgotten prayers built out of everything the world refused to believe in. It took one step forward, and the moment his foot crossed into that impossible light, all the crosses in the orphanage turned upright again. No fire, no storm, just restoration. Then came the sound. Not music, not angels, just a single note, long and aching, like the universe exhaling a word it couldn't pronounce. And Daniel was gone, but not missing, because his absence left behind much meaning to ever be considered empty. Graven whispered, "He wasn't chosen, he volunteered." And I picked up the last piece of parchment from the floor. On it was a single line, written in Daniel's hand. "If you must build a church, build it around silence, for that is where truth hides best." Episode 15, The World After the Cross. They took down the bell from St. Delphinus, not because it cracked, because it stopped ringing, and no one could remember what it had ever sounded like. The children didn't ask where Daniel went, because deep down, they knew he hadn't gone anywhere. He had simply become a silence too sacred to echo. The eye on the cross never reopened, not on any of them, not on the walls, not in dreams, but something remained. A weight, like the feeling of having just woken from a dream so important. You're terrified to forget it, but don't understand it enough to write it down. Sister Miriam never touched another rosary. She Saturday in the garden every morning, staring into the fog, as if waiting for a voice that no longer needed to speak aloud. And Elias Graven's room remained locked, but faint melodies were heard behind it, not hymns, just fragments, notes remembered, not son and me. I never left St. Delphinus, because how do you walk away from the only place the sky ever answered back? Some nights, the wind shifts and brings with it a warmth, not heat, not breeze, just the sensation of presence. And in those moments, we don't light candles, we don't kneel, we don't pray, we simply listen, as if the child is still speaking, but in a language the world hasn't deserved to learn yet. One final page remained in Daniel's notebook, blank, until this morning. I found it under my pillow, where I know I didn't place it. The ink was still fresh. It read, "If you're reading this, you survived faith, now survive truth." And ton, a small sketch of a child smiling, no cross, just a hand pressed against his chest, as if keeping something inside, until the world becomes quiet enough to carry it again. So we wait, not for miracles, not for angels, not even for Daniel. We wait for the day the world stops shouting long enough to remember what was whispered.